All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Adrian Galarza. As I mentioned earlier, I work with Capital One as an agile delivery lead. It's a fancy way of saying Scrum Master plus other things. And on one of my teams right now, I've been working as product owner since about late March. And we know it's not ideal to have both jobs, but in reality, when our teams need our assistance like that, we step in and do what we need until that vacancy is filled. So today I would like to tell you guys a little bit about this cool practice called example mapping. And that's part of BDD, behavior driven development. Okay, so a little bit about me. I have a variety of experience in the past. I've worked in technology most recently. Before going into technology, I worked in operations with Amazon, sending you guys packages, sending everybody their stuff. Pretty interesting. Worked in supply chain in the military and educational background. Have an MBA from Carnegie Mellon, and my undergrad was in finance. Looking at Agile, have quite a few certifications, including product owner, most recently safe product owner from about a month ago. And here's a bunch of other stuff that you probably are not too interested in. So let's get to the interesting part. Okay, so in this session, please, I'd like to make it a little bit collaborative. If you all have something to share, please raise your hand, or actually, I think Red's going to be kind of facilitating from the back end here while I'm talking, but please feel free to share your experiences. So one thing I wanted to ask you all, how would you describe effective backlog refinement? Have you seen it? No one? What are some words that come to mind? Just throw out a few words.
We got some stuff in the chat. I put in there only once that I see one team really work at it. Team conversation understanding, a ready backlog. Yes, it's magical when it's done right. And Kimberly just put in silent. Or Kimber, I should think.
Yeah, my dog is barking. Yes, silent. I am really frustrated with backlog grooming right now. So yeah, mine is silent.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Don't know what happened there with my mouse.
Yes, the robots are against us.
The robot apocalypse. So next question. Thank you all for sharing that. What about ineffective refinement? What are some words that you would use to describe that?
Let's do the second one first. I'm sorry, I had misread it. I'm sorry.
No problem. I like to start with the positive thing first and then have the countering. Translating vague into specific needs was effective, I think.
So Karen has put a hot mess. I put in my comment is very common.
Yes, unfortunately, that is the case. And then Mark says product owner and analyst dictated the refinement. Team members are not available or lack of team input. So those are all definitely some of the symptoms that we see. Someone writing user stories without knowing what is needed. Definitely that's another one. So next question, what are some of the challenges that you see in unstructured refinement sessions? I think we covered a lot of those. We already answered that question, so we can skip that unless y'all want to keep sharing. Please do so. So for my background, an example, what I often see is something like this. So I was working on a team that was replacing a legacy system. And what we would often hear is somebody from the business side was just giving us like vague requirements. It would sound something like, hey, the system that we have now, it already works, just make it do that. So that's not very easy, right? The developers had to go in and try to decipher the code in a legacy system, there's often like a lot of old legacy stuff that might not even work, but tech debt is there. So some of this code might not have even been removed, but they try to decipher all of this, and it's pretty hard to do. So the next step was that developers would write some software where there was a lot of misunderstandings or assumptions. And then the point of view from the developers is the answer to my question is not in the user story. And I've already bothered my PO like several times today. I don't want to keep bothering him. Let me just make an assumption. We'll work on it. Let's see how it goes. So the developers, the next step would be the developers hand off defective software to testers, whoever's testing it, whether it's product side or within the agile team. And then we spend a lot of time trying to find defects, but because there's assumptions built in, a lot of times we make the assumption that, okay, it does work, it does meet our assumptions, but maybe the assumption was incorrect. I see somebody says, this is the story of my life right now. And sorry to hear that, but it's very common. Hopefully we can give you some ideas on what to try. All right, so now then what happens is developers would seek clarification, right? Like we show it in sprint review and we get feedback. Okay, maybe it doesn't do, like we need this other type of calculation in this field, or that's not exactly what we meant. We want something done slightly differently. So then what happens? All right, we can make that change. You know, most of the developers that I've met are very helpful, very willing to do what our business partners need. So the answer is going to be, yeah, we can make that change. Let's do a next sprint. And that thing is still not done, right? And potentially could go on in a cycle. So why do we need something better than what we're seeing right now and what you are all describing? So backlog refinement, we find that it's often not a complete substitute for collaboration. So sometimes we do need to bother the product owner or a business analyst if you have that on your team. Also, error-free communication a lot of times needs more than just user stories to reduce rework. If any of you have worked in the old traditional waterfall or PMP methodologies, there's mountains of paperwork, right? Mountains of requirements. And no matter how much you write, it seems like there's always the possibility of miscommunication or misunderstanding. Another reason, documentation is often inadequate. I think I kind of covered that one, but it's inadequate or inaccurate in two different ways. Like maybe the requirements are not detailed enough. Plus, even if you have great documentation in the beginning, your software will live on for a while, right? Maybe years, maybe decades. And over time, there's going to be changes. How often, when there are changes, do people go back and update their documentation? In my experience, that's been pretty rare. So one way that we can try to mitigate this is through a practice called behavior-driven development. And it's actually a set of practices. The intention is to make this a collaborative approach to bridge a communication gap between business and IT so that we can build a better product. It helps us communicate better requirements by using examples. And this will be more precise and it'll help us find defects earlier, hopefully even be able to prevent defects. And we can produce software that remains more easily maintainable over time. And this is really a customer-focused approach to build the right thing. Okay, any questions so far from anyone? All right, so next up, let's go with an overview of the 3 practices of BDD. There's kind of 3 stages, if you think of it that way. The first one is discovery. This includes a refinement. This is where we create a shared understanding of the requirements by collaborating. And it's usually through a structured conversation that's centered on rules and examples. Just remember that part, rules and examples. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And the idea is just that we deliver quality software rather than working in isolation. And we don't want to just be passing emails back and forth, Slack messages, text, whatever it is. So we get people together, and these days it's probably a Zoom meeting, but it's better than firing off an email. Okay, the next stage is formulation. And this is an example of system behavior. This is where we document it. We're using business terminology. And this is using a language called Gherkin, where we would use kind of a structure that says, given a scenario, when something happens, then I want an outcome like this to happen. And it's very high level, but this is kind of outside of the scope of this talk. I just wanted to give you all an overview of it. And then the next step is automation. And this is really where the developers are doing the coding of tests that were developed during the formulation part. And that's using Gherkin. So they will use it and maybe SpecFlow or SpecRunner build in the tests so that these automated tests are repeatable. They still will be able to test the rules that we set up. So for the rest of this talk, we're gonna focus on the discovery part of it. And I wanna show you all a quick video here to give you an idea of what one of these discovery sessions would look like.
Detail.
Let me know if y'all can't hear it. I think I set it up right.
Here's my example. Yesterday, I was waiting for my regular train home from work. I have a half-hour commute, so I like to have something to read on the train. Because the train goes through a rural area where the mobile signal is bad, I scanned my Twitter feed and fired up a browser tab with interesting-looking articles to read before I get on the train. Most of the articles were about software development, but there were a couple about politics too. Now we're talking. We have a concrete example with loads of context. That really gives us something to work with. Now we're going to see how we use these concrete examples in practice. A prerequisite for doing BDD is to have an agile process in place. BDD needs to be done just in time at the last responsible moment, because we place a lot of emphasis on conversations rather than trying to write everything down. If you try to have those conversations too far ahead of doing the work, you'll have forgotten most of what you talked about. So you need to have your work already broken down into user stories. Ideally, you'll have also started to define acceptance criteria or business rules for those stories. But they don't need to be exhaustive yet. We'll flesh them out during the BDD process. Let's imagine we're building a point-of-sale system for an electronics retailer, Dixie's. Here's our next user story: process refunds. In order to satisfy customers' statutory rights, as a sales assistant, I need to be able to process refunds. In order to prepare this story for development, we have what we call a Three Amigos meeting. We call it the Three Amigos because it involves three different disciplines from the team: test, development, and product. Let's watch one in action.
The business rules for this story are really simple. Any item can be returned within 14 days as long as the customer has a receipt.
Can you give me an example?
Okay. Colin, the customer, bought a kettle last week from us. When he got home, he realised the colour didn't match his kitchen cabinets and he really didn't like it. He's brought it back to the store for a refund. He walks up to Sally, a junior sales assistant, and he asks her to process the refund.
What's the outcome here? What are we supposed to test?
Well, we need to increment the stock quantity for that item so we know it's back in our inventory.
Right, anything else?
No, I think that's all.
What if Colin doesn't have his receipt? Does Sally have to send him home?
Well, a manager can process a refund with any proof of purchase. Colin could use a bank statement, for example, but Sally can't do that, so she would have to ask her boss.
Right, so there are 2 rules here. The customer must have proof of purchase, not just the receipt. And if they don't have their receipt, then it must be authorised by a manager, right?
Oh, right, exactly.
Aren't we forgetting something here? Isn't Colin supposed to get his money back?
Oh, yes, of course.
And does the system need to notify anyone in the warehouse to come and pick up the kettle?
Good idea, Tammy. Yes. I think that's out of our scope for this version of the story, but I'll put it on the backlog for future iteration.
All right, what did y'all think about this video? See some thumbs up. Kimber, I think you were saying something, but you were on mute.
Oh, I was saying, I think it's a good explanation. Yeah.
You know, if you think of, imagine a team that was trying to come up with these features, how a conversation normally would go. And without the context of showing, like thinking of what the actual customer is doing, maybe some of those questions would not have come up. Like maybe somebody's talking about a story. Okay, process a refund. We want to be able to just give the customer his money back. And then nobody maybe would not even consider, what do we do with the item? Do we need to do something with sending it back to inventory? Some of the other questions around it, but when you think about it in like a story format, I think it helps us think more about like, what are all the other repercussions, or what other things should we be considering? Because I think I've read in probably a few places that humans, we like to hear stories, and we're not made to hear requirements necessarily, and stories might make more sense to us and generate more ideas. Okay, we'll continue on.
You're back. You're looking good.
All right. Thank you, Red. Okay, so and one of the practices that we use in discovery is called example mapping. And so before we even put this user story into development, we need to have that conversation so that we can clarify and confirm what the acceptance criteria is. Maybe we identify other user stories that will also need to be done, or different considerations that we need to take, potentially different acceptance criteria. And one way to do this is by having what we call a 3 amigos meeting, like they showed in the video. And it's often made up of the product owner or a representative, somebody that's going to be testing it, and then somebody that's from development. And I've seen teams use this in like 15 to 30 minutes, and it's been helpful because they use these rules and concrete examples that help us find out and discover what we don't know. And we'll go more into detail about what rules and examples are, but one thing is that rules typically end up having multiple examples. And if you think about it, it's kind of like positive and negative test cases also. Okay, so example mapping. Let me give you a preview here of where we're going. When we're in a physical space, typically we end up using Post-its in these different colors, and we use different colors to represent stories, rules, examples, and then questions. And we'll come back to that part. So the rules are the business logic that summarize a bunch of examples or express another set of constraints or a constraint about the scope of the story. The examples are like specific scenarios that represent that rule. Questions, sometimes we're in a discussion and we come up with a good question, but we want to capture it in these Post-its so that we don't forget about it, because that could be a very important question for us to resolve as we're trying to refine these stories. And then the user stories will be those yellow cards. As we're discussing something, a lot of times we end up identifying new user stories that we might not have thought of before. So if we capture them here, then it'll be easier for us to come back and refine those later also. Okay, so let's go a little bit into the rules and examples. So a rule is, think of it as maybe an acceptance criteria or business requirement, summarizes a set of examples, and then the examples are the specific ones that, and they help us draw conclusions that are not necessarily explicitly stated. So what about this first one? When let's see if you identify if it's a rule or an example. The first one, when a customer buys 4 books in a single purchase, the cheapest of the 4 books should be free. Is that a rule or an example?
That's a rule.
That's a rule.
Yep. And then the next one, customer puts 4 books costing 25, 20, 22, 15 into their shopping cart and a discount of $15.
Example.
Yay. Too easy. Good job. I wish all our real rules and examples were this simple, huh?
You're right.
All right, so I showed you all how we would do this, and even being virtual, there's other tools that we can use, even if we're not using Post-its. You probably use a ton of them already. Google Jamboard, or even Miro, Slides. What are some other good tools? Sorry? SharePoint.
Worst case scenario.
Lucid.
Did somebody say Post-it?
Lucid. It's another whiteboard.
Lucid?
Yeah.
Ah,
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one.
Their security protocols are usually acceptable by many organizations where Miro might not be.
interesting.
Yeah.
Nice.
That.
Eva's saying in chat, idea board.
Oh,
I
wow.
like idea boards too. They're really good.
Really cool. Thank you all for sharing that. That's awesome. I heard of a couple of new tools that I hadn't heard of before.
What are you guys using at Capital One?
Mainly Jamboard and some internally developed tools. So we use the whole Google suite. So sometimes it's Google Slides or Jamboard. Here, I can share it. I think I can show you all a Jamboard real quick. I think it's even available for anybody that has a Google account. It's very basic. This is a Jamboard. So you just add cards, pick whatever color.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. It was a low barrier to entry. It was a pretty quick learning curve. So, all right, any questions or comments so far?
Nothing in the chat.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's try one of these. Let's imagine we have this user story. We're working for a company that's developing the software for an ATM. And the story is, as a debit card holder who is withdrawing money from this ATM, I want the ATM to dispense bills in a mix of small and large bills so that I can spend it easily. The constraints are that the ATM contains 10s, 20s, 50s, and 100s. I think in reality, I only see 10s and 20s, but we're going to have a cooler ATM than other people. All right, so the acceptance criteria is that the ATM should dispense at least one $10 bill, and also that the ATM should withdraw a $3 fee for withdrawals when the debit card is not issued by this bank.
I can tell you work for a bank.
To 2 banks in a row so far.
I see the problem.
All right, so looking at this, right, we're using the yellow cards for the story. So we would write it or put it up on Jamboard or Miro. And then the 2 rules would be like the acceptance criteria that we talked about just now. Where it gets interesting is looking at going one step further beyond the rule and trying to figure out the examples so that we can glean that context and maybe come up with questions or other acceptance criteria, other rules, other stories. So then for this rule, the example is formulated using 3 different criteria, like context, action, and outcome. If we think of those, we'll come up with a pretty solid concrete example.
So you don't want to use given, when, then?
The given, when, then part, we can do that also. That's like the formulation part.
Okay.
That's the next step in BDD that we're not covering yet.
Okay.
But these will help us come up with the given, when, then also. And it's actually very, very parallel. Context is the given, when is the action, and then the outcome is then. So given that an ATM is full of cash, when $20 is requested, then 2 $10 bills are dispensed. That was a good question, Red. I think I'll need to change this here. Okay, so would somebody like to take a shot at coming up with an example of how we would discuss this rule?
Sam, Tom? Okay, Karen?
So ATM is out of $10 bills.
Everybody's asking that question.
Oh, good one. Okay, so how would you explain that as using this context of an example?
I'm looking at a rule, and given the way the rule is written, I'm not sure how I would handle it, because it has to dispense at least one $10 bill, and if I do not have it, then I cannot dispense any money, even if I have 20s. So it seems like the rule needs to be possibly changed.
Yeah, so maybe that's a separate rule under the user story. You just uncovered a new rule. So one of the rules is to dispense at least a $10 bill. What about a new rule that says when there are no $10 bills, then we give them the lowest denomination that the ATM has within it?
Or rephrase the rule to say ATM should dispense at least one lowest denomination bill it contains, in which case it covers all cases.
Mm-hmm.
Is that not specific enough? I'm new to this.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably not specific enough, because in this case, it's the business unit that's saying, okay, give at least one $10 bill. But maybe I would probably go with like having a separate rule that says if there's no $10 bills, give a 20 or give the next lowest denomination. It depends on your example. I think it always could vary depending on what the business requirements are.
Yeah, the common answer is it depends, and just go with what you feel will work for right now. And then as you go along, you figure out if it's too much detail, not enough detail, and then learn.
Yep. And yeah, that answer can change in every context. And it's all about learning, right? When we're starting a new practice, jump in, try it out, see what works for you, and adapt from there. Okay, would anyone like to try another example of this rule? What about you, Red? Or okay, go
I've
ahead.
got one.
Awesome.
I've got one. So your example, the context is that the ATM is full of cash, and the customer is not, the debit card is not from, the debit card the customer uses is not from the bank.
Mm-hmm.
The customer requests $50 or $60, even $60, right? From their account.
Sure. And the outcome?
I'm working on it. So the outcome, because the $1, so we're required a $3 fee, which is going to require 2 1s in addition to a 5 to give back to the user if you've got, if you're divisible, if the amount requested is divisible by 10. Right? Or you need 2 1s if the amount is divisible by 5. But the $1 was not in the acceptance criteria for the machine, right? It was only 5.
Yeah, what's missing from these examples is the amount debited from the account. So there, Kimber, in your case, you would dispense the $60, 2 10s, 2 20s, but you would debit the account for 63.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
where
Not
you,
debited, so it's not debited from the amount dispensed, it's debited from the account. Okay, so that was a clarification in the business rule.
and then the question is, what do we do with that $3? Because your
Yep.
debits and your credits have to equal, so you probably have to credit some account someplace else in the big system in the sky.
Right. Great.
Gosh, I really love this conversation that we just had here, because it just highlights how easily something that's written can be misinterpreted.
Yep.
And if we were having this conversation in one of those 3 Amigo sessions, we would have cleared it up just like you all cleared it up just now, instead of, can you imagine the alternative that a developer or a team goes and develops based on the misunderstanding, come back to a sprint review 2 weeks later, and it's not necessarily what the product owner had intended. And now how much time have we wasted? And now we got to go back and change things. That
Bruce
was
says,
awesome.
Bruce says, been there, done that.
Haven't we all? So I wish we could have done this in person. It would be a little more fun to be interactive. It's kind of fun to play with the cards and be talking through some examples in small groups. Maybe I'll try to see how we can do this digitally for another session of this in the future. Does anyone have any questions or want to share anything they learned out of this part of it?
Yes, I do, Adrian. I don't know how out of place this question will be, but is there, could there be a history to the rule? Like, why would the rule here be the ATM should dispense at least one $10 bill? Is there any kind of history behind it?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you try to rephrase?
Well, my question is, when rules are made, either from wherever the rule comes from, and could we ask questions on why the rule should be this way? Is there a history? Because ATM can dispense $5, $1, $20, and here the rule is specific for $10. I'm beginning to ask, is there a specific reason why this rule should be this way?
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you for clarifying that. So this is just an example. I mean, it's I'm just using something as something to work with here, but this could be maybe your bank has done customer, or your organization has done customer research and says, hey, our customers like to come to bank X because when they like to get cash, they like to get small bills. So let me give you like an example here. I get to travel a lot. In the past, I got to travel a lot. And one of the countries that I went to was Cambodia. And Cambodia actually uses US dollars. And they, in their ATM, they give you US dollars. And their local currency is used for anything that's less than $1. And because of the different economy, trying to change a $20 bill in Cambodia, depending on where you are, can be kind of tough because it's a lot of money and people don't always have change for that. So in this case, maybe it's a bank that was doing business in Cambodia and they want to give their customers smaller bills so that they can more easily spend the money. So this would be just an example of like something that your organization might come up with for their business purposes or their context.
That makes
Does that help?
sense. You answered very well. That makes sense. And I'm just generally asking the question. Generally, I know this is an example, but yeah.
Coming soon to Venezuela. Man, I saw that comment. Okay, I see somebody says different colors help bring clarity and focus on differences between story, rules, and examples, facilitates discussion. Yes, thanks for sharing that, Mark. And, you know, as you're having this conversation, the cool thing about these different colors is like Basil's question just now, why do we want to make it at least one $10 bill? Let's say we're in that Three Amigos session. We don't know the answer. It's just somebody in our business unit said it's got to be, you got to give at least one $10 bill. We could always go back and write one of these red questions. What that means, it's kind of like a future conversation. Okay, I need to find out the answer to this because it might be relevant. It might be relevant. So you would ask, why do we need to give at least a $10 bill? What also might happen during that discussion is that, hey, we identified a new rule when somebody said, what if we're out of $10 bills? Write another card, another blue card that would say, this is a new rule, and we can get to that later, but we keep track of it so that we know that we need to have that conversation.
Tom, you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Yes, Adrian. So I'm kind of early product owner here. I'm a product owner wannabe. Anyway, so the question I have is, should the product owner do a better job of articulating most of the rules for the application before the Three Amigos meeting, or should the product owner kind of refrain, just issue a set of guidelines and allow the Three Amigos team to develop the full set of rules?
Yeah, good question. BDD and what I've learned in a class doesn't really go into that part, but I can share with you what worked for us in my previous team.
Right.
What we would do is just go in. So we would share, a product owner would say, okay, next stories that we're going to be discussing is these next three. We're going to be working on these next. Let's focus on story one in the next Three Amigos meeting. And that at least would get people primed to start thinking about what that story would be. And then in the Three Amigos meeting, we called it refinement level 1. It was just a very small group. It was maybe just those 3 people, maybe 4 people when I joined. And that's where we started having the conversation. And the product owner would just maybe start with just the user story. I want the, you know, with this typical format like I'm showing here. And then he would go into the context like, all right, I'm using the ATM for our bank. And I want to make it easy for our customers to use it. He would start giving the context
Right.
and maybe go into a more concrete example, like the one I gave. Our ATMs in Cambodia. I'm traveling. People don't have a lot of change for the big bills, and start giving some of that context as that conversation is happening. A lot of these questions would just naturally evolve and be asked and answered in that session.
So maybe your best day is to present the human behavior attributes that you've studied as a product owner, and present those attributes, the human attributes, to the team, and allow the team to help develop the user stories as you go along, right?
Yeah, I would say,
My experience is you want to take advantage. You've got some very bright people involved in software development.
yes.
And you don't want to dumb them down. You want to basically take advantage of their skills and their talent. And the best way to do that is to challenge them towards, what type of goals you're trying to accomplish, right?
Right. Yeah. That's another one that depends, but yeah, I think use your talent as best as you can. Maybe you're in a situation where you're, as a product owner, you already know some of the rules, so share that with the team.
Right.
Then when you go into that refinement session or this Three Amigos session, excuse me, maybe new rules emerge as people ask questions.
Right.
Like
So
the
don't
one
don't try to know everything, but try to provide as much, of the facts you can regarding the application, and let the team help develop the overall direction and goals.
Sure. Yeah. Share what you have. If I can summarize it, share what you have, and then collaborate to find out the rest of the gaps that are identified during the conversations.
Got it.
So a product owner was diagnosed with a terminal disease and was going to pass away. And he wrote in his will that his developers would lower him into the ground. And the reason he said this is, I want them to lower me down so they can let me down one last time. And the developers laughed. He goes, finally, clear requirements. Sorry.
Nice. Right. I think you should include at least one product owner joke in future meetups.
I'll take that under advisement. Yeah. So have we have a discussion later about when to use rules and such? Questions cards?
Yeah, so with those red question cards, I think anytime that you're discussing this, new questions would come up and during the conversation. If nobody in the room has an answer to that question, write one of these red cards, save it for later, and then go after the answer outside of that session. Maybe ask somebody to take ownership so that it actually gets done and not everybody assumes that somebody's going to do it.
So a couple of years ago, there was a book out there called Specification by Example. Many of us just call it Spec by Example. This looks like a slightly more formalized version of that, where you just don't say what the examples are. It's categorized underneath a rule, a business rule, or maybe it's a process rule, things of that nature. So if you're interested, also look for Spec by Example in addition to example mapping.
Yep. And if you're interested in any of the other practices of BDD, like formulation and automation that we didn't get a chance to talk about today, they're separate books. Here's some of the books that are related to BDD. I've only read the discovery one so far.
And there's actually a 39-minute video on example mapping.
Oh yeah, this one was pretty good too. It's 39 minutes, so I'll share the link here with everybody. Unless y'all want to stay for 39 minutes.
Example mappings.
That's okay.
I thought you might pass.
Cool. Introducing example mapping is the title of that video. Cool.
Yep. All right. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? Yeah, we'll be sharing the presentation.
Fantastic.
All right. Back to you, Red.
Well, Adrian, thank you so much for sharing this evening. At this point, we'll stop the recording.